Hello, I was just saying I feel like a newscaster. My name's Jennifer Down. I'm here tonight as part of our first live streamed Express Media Toolkit session, and we're really, really lucky. All of these broadcasts are live streamed that feature guest artists, and tonight we're super lucky to have Omar Musa joining us. He is a multi-award winning rapper, poet and novelist from Queanbeyan, and he's coming to us live, in fact, from his new pad there. He is the author of Here Come the Dogs, which was published in 2014, was longlisted for the Miles Franklin and also for the Dublin International Literary Award. He's also, he's done a lot of things in his short life. He's been on Q&A. He has delivered a TED talk at the Sydney Opera House to a standing ovation. And he's also the author of 2 poetry books, one of which was just released earlier this year. So he's joining us tonight. We are really keen, as I said, this is one of the sessions that's open to everyone, the general public, not just this year's Toolkits participants. So we would really love it if you would post your questions on Facebook and on Twitter. You can use the hashtag EM Toolkits, and yeah, just send them along as you think of them, and we'll relay them to Omar. Omar, thanks for joining us.
Not a problem, my pleasure. All right, are you handing it over to me? Yes.
I'm abdicating all responsibility.
All right. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Omar Musa. I'm coming to you live and direct from Queanbeyan, New South Wales, Struggle Town, the 2620. This is my new pad. I call it El Dorado because treasure hunters come here to search for gold. And that's what we're all trying to do, I guess, as poets, as writers, fiction writers, short story writers, script writers, or just artists of any ilk. So I'm going to be chatting to you a little bit about my background. I come from an artistic family. My father was an actor and a poet in Malaysia. My mother was a theatre historian and a theatre director here in Australia. She comes from Western New South Wales, good Irish, Protestant Irish stock. But you know, the thing about Malaysian people and Irish people is that they are very good yarn spinners, storytellers. So I always loved storytelling from a very young age. And I guess I started scribbling down my first thoughts almost like a diary, but I realized they took a certain shape and sometimes they would rhyme, and I realized that it wasn't just diary entries, they were actually little poems. And so I guess poetry was the first thing that came to me. It was the first means to express my stories and my thoughts, and I guess was a form of therapy as well. But when I was young, I was always looking for a form of poetry that was vibrant, that was youthful, that was sort of fiery, and poetry, you know, at school it seemed very dusty, it seemed kind of boring and maybe a little bit pretentious, something that was reserved only for the halls of academia or something like that. But when I was in my early teens, I came across a form of music, hip-hop music, and it wasn't actually the sort of glamour of it or the fashion that drew me towards hip-hop. It was that I immediately identified that this was poetry, and it was a sort of poetry that I wanted to make. It was personal, it was profane, it was political, but it could also be very sweet and get to matters of the heart in a very direct manner. And so I kind of became obsessed with hip-hop music, and I started making my own records and everything. And then that somehow led me back to poetry because I started hearing about poetry slams. You know, many of you would have seen them. It's sort of a competitive performance style of poetry. But, you know, there would be all sorts of different people coming there. There would be avant-garde poets, older poets. There would be bush poets, rappers, all mingling and telling their stories on stage. And it really sort of helped revitalize poetry among young people in this country, I think, particularly young people of minority backgrounds. And then through that, I was lucky enough, and I would say it was luck, I won the Australian Poetry Slam at the Sydney Opera House in about 2008, so it was almost 10 years ago. And the prize for that was to go to the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival in Bali. And it was there that I started meeting a lot of fiction writers, short story writers, and novelists. And I was very drawn to the novelists because I'd always loved reading. I was an only child. I would sort of often just be by myself, like, tucked away with a novel. And it sort of allowed me access to so many other worlds, so many other times. But also, there's something about fiction and about novels that grant you direct access to somebody else's thoughts in a way that no other art form can do. You literally can read someone else's thoughts in a novel, and I was drawn to that, and I saw it as it was something that I had always aspired to do, was to write a novel. So I guess I'm going to try and hand you some little pieces of advice and little tips that I've picked up along the way. Usually these are things I've pilfered from far better writers than myself. But I think the basis of all good writing and all good art is an attitude. And that attitude is one of bravery. It is one of fearlessness. It is a brave act to put your thoughts and your feelings on the page. And so that should be the foundation stone of all of your writing, I think. Even if you're writing about your fears, somehow you must be fearless. And I think that, to me, my definition of poetry is, and fiction, I suppose too, is finding the right word vessel for an emotional or intellectual risk. To me, it's all about taking a leap of faith and risking something of yourself, of your heart, and of your mind. And then this leads me to something really important, which is that in order to get better at writing, you must be willing to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, because that's the only way. It's only through making mistakes that you will have a breakthrough of some sort, or create something original, create something that was not there before. And so, to paraphrase one of my favorite writers, the great Dominican-American writer, Junot Diaz, he said that when he was writing his books, he often felt lost. And at first this, sort of made him feel depressed and sort of deranged, I guess. But then after a while, he realized, actually, it's a good thing to feel lost as a writer, because if you feel lost, it means that you are somewhere where no one else has been. If you don't feel lost, it means maybe you're trekking over the same territory that people have been before, and who wants to do that? And so being willing to make mistakes is really important. It's only through trial and error that you get better at writing. And before I forget, there is no good writing without good reading as well. So it's really important, I think, to read widely. I sometimes encounter people who are aspiring writers, and you ask them who their favorite writers are, and they don't really read that much, and that's just absolutely insane to me. And then also it gave me reassurance, that quote I gave you before about that it's okay to feel lost, that sort of reassured me. And just know that it's the most common feeling in the world amongst writers. Even someone as capable and masterful as the great American novelist Cormac McCarthy, when he was writing his book Blood Meridian, apparently he threw the manuscript across the room and didn't look at it for 6 months, because it drove him so crazy, and he felt so lost and directionless with it. So that also made me feel a bit better, that a master like that could have that same feeling that I've had. But it's a long graft, it's hard work, and it's in the editing, really, I suppose, and the hard work of editing, that a work really takes shape. And so I was once given a really good piece of advice by a Filipino writer, which was that you should write in passion and edit in cold blood, because I think it's important to balance these two sides, the visceral and the cerebral. The emotions, the emotions, of course, are important, and I think that's what I'm drawn to, is works of emotional depth. But it's in sculpting the words in that cool light of day where the real alchemy of writing happens. And that's where form, I suppose, comes in, and you start to figure out, again, as I said before, what the best word vessel is for your thoughts and your feelings. I can give you an example, I suppose, from my own career. I've only written one novel called Here Come the Dogs, but when I started writing it, I was trying to write it in big, chunky blocks of prose, use the format of a traditional novel, I suppose, and it was just very clunky. Everything felt awkwardly phrased. And so I was becoming really frustrated with the process of writing this novel, and I thought maybe I didn't have it in me. But then I read a book called The Monkey's Mask by Dorothy Porter, a great Australian writer, and she wrote verse novels. So it was fiction, but each scene was a little standalone poem in a way. And it was exciting, it was thrilling, the plot was cracking along at a fast pace, but each scene, each little vignette was a little poem. And so I started experimenting with this form, and I sort of combined Australian colloquialisms with more sort of sculpted poetry, and I realized that that could be my access point to fiction. And then after that, I started building third-person prose around these little tiny poems, these little tiny scenes. So as you might be able to tell, for me, these are all just different branches of the same river of storytelling. I don't make the distinction between really prose and poetry and maybe even scripts. Even in Here Come the Dogs, I dropped into little bits that were sort of just transcriptions of dialogue. And so I sort of feel like it's fun to play fast and loose with these things. I guess one thing that's really important when writing fiction is you must think about structure. You have to think about plot. Sometimes it's good to know what the rules are with plot so that then you can subvert them or break them later on. But you have to know. And so that was a piece of advice some great Australian writers gave me very early on. Nam Lee and Christoph Scholkes and Helen Garner, I remember. All of them said the same thing. Think about structure. You always have to be concerned with this. And I can talk about it, I guess, in a metaphorical way, that with my poems and my raps, that was sort of like becoming an artisan and creating stained glass windows. But when it comes to writing a novel, you have to become an architect who is building a cathedral with many different rooms and different rooms that serve different functions, I suppose. And so I've always found the plot side of things quite difficult. And so as a training ground, I've tried to take a lot of cues from television, shows like The Wire, movies, and plays as well. Playwrights are the greatest distillers of plot. And so to take a lead from those type of writers, you can then sort of combine the two approaches, because some people don't like the idea of being too much of a plotter, where you know exactly where your novel's going to go right from the beginning, and you have it all in dot points, and then it's just, coloring it in. Some people don't like that, and are sort of more fly by the seat of your pants type writers who will just throw all their thoughts out, and then sort of like Ariadne following the string through the labyrinth, sort of then find out what the book is about. I like to balance these two things, and I've heard of writers like Orhan Pamuk who will do it a little bit this way. So, you have that spontaneity and the writing in hot blood, but then Orhan Pamuk will also take notes in, maybe a separate file on his computer about where he thinks the novel may be going and how that changes as he sort of finds out what the novel is. And so sort of having a bit of a storyboard, but then letting yourself have that ecstatic exuberance of creativity as well. I suppose the other thing to think about that's super important and really fun to me when writing fiction is the characters. And I think it's important, and this helps with plot as well. You must give your characters things they want and want really badly. And so that means that they have motivations, they have direction, and that will lead them to act upon these motivations. And it's about action, and that's what drives the plot forward. So if you give your characters good, strong motivations, that will then lead on to the plot developing. And I suppose in that way, I sometimes see myself as a bit of a torturer of my characters, because you want to put them under so much extreme pressure and in extreme situations that they are forced to act in some way or another, good or bad. And I think that is at the heart of dramatic writing in fiction. And a great writer, Irvine Welsh from Scotland, he considers himself to be an extreme dramatist. And I think that in this way, this gets sort of to the heart of what fiction is about, and drama, and that is about the indestructible human spirit hell-bent on destroying itself. And so there's one you can write down from your old Uncle Omar here in QBN. And another thing when it comes to characters and plot is that triangles work really well. Any good love story, for instance, yes, it can be between two people, but it's always far more dramatic if there's an interplay between 3 points. So I always try and keep that in my head as well. Triangles are very good for dramatic tension. What else did I have here? Oh yeah, I guess one thing people often ask me, and actually before I give this little piece of advice, just remember, don't take anything I say too seriously. It's always best to sort of find your own way, I think. I'm just a shit talker from Queanbeyan, but some of these things might work for you, but they might not as well. So it comes back to trial and error and making mistakes. The one thing people always ask me about is how to deal with writer's block. And the tyranny of the blank page is something that every single writer knows about, whether you're 10 years old or 58 years old. Everyone has faced up to that blank page and thought, I don't know what to put on it, or I feel frozen. And I've found one thing that works really well for me, aside from just leaving it and realizing that it's stuck and then going and doing something completely different, like playing sport or whatever. But one thing that has worked well for me is to go back to the classics. And I don't mean sort of the canon, I mean your personal classics, things that you loved reading, that inflamed your imagination, even things you liked as a kid. And I guarantee you, if you go back and read a great book or something you really loved before, within about 3 pages of reading, an image, a piece of dialogue, a plot twist, a beautifully phrased sentence will inflame your imagination again and spark get those creative juices going again. So as I said before, there's no good writing without good reading. So when you come up against writer's block, I've found that that's something really useful for me. So I'll go back and read one of my favorite poets like Anne Sexton. I'll go back and read some Dorothy Porter. I might grab some Cormac McCarthy or Roberto Bolaño or Lorca off my shelf, and guaranteed something will jump out at me that will get me going again. What else did I want to yarn to you guys about? Jennifer talked a little bit about the idea of ethics in fiction and who has the right to tell a certain story. And there's a lot of controversy and debates around the idea of cultural appropriation. For instance, should a white male writer write from the perspective of a black woman? And this is something I think a lot about and I find kind of fascinating. Essentially, I think that fiction is appropriation. I mean, Otherwise, we'd all just be writing the minutiae of our daily lives down, and we could only ever write from our personal perspective. However, there are pitfalls involved in this, especially in this kind of post-colonial world where there's so much disparity and where the narratives about certain ethnic groups or religions have been controlled by another group. And there are so many stereotypes and destructive narratives about a lot of ethnicities and races that are reperpetuated in books and in television and everything. So I have three things that I think about when trying to write a character from another culture or ethnicity, which I have done a lot of. Like in Here Come the Dogs, I write from the point of view of a Samoan character and Macedonian character. These are not my ethnicities or my background. Firstly, I think you must write from a point of view of empathy with any character. And so inherent in that is asking yourself the question, why is it that I am writing from the point of view of this ethnicity? What is my motivation? Before you ask, what is my character's motivation? Secondly, I think as much research as possible has to go into it. Sometimes you get the feeling that there's maybe a white person who's written a black character that has never really even chatted to any black people or researched the history of it. And so I think the research is really crucial. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, if you are to write from the point of view of a character that has a background that is not your own, you have to be willing to face criticism for it from people who are of that background. You have to have, again, the bravery, the fearlessness to cop that on the chin. If someone says, you know what, I think you totally screwed that up and that was very disrespectful to black people or to Muslim people, you sort of have to take that. I think sometimes white writers think that they should all of a sudden just get immediate kudos for being so fearless as to even attempt this thing. And I, you know, in my own personal life, well, in my writing, I've kind of thought about this a lot too. Like if a Samoan person came up to me and said, you know, that was very reductive, you were just reinforcing stereotypes, you know, that would really hurt. It hasn't actually happened, but I think it's inherent in that process. None of us are immune to criticism, especially when partaking in the risky act of writing from the point of view of someone whose culture is not your own. All right, I think that's covered.
That's great. I was just going to jump in and ask, because I'm glad that you kind of finished with voice, because the topic we're kind of looking at this week for the Toolkits participants is voice, and that means a lot of different things. We can talk about narrative voice or dialogue. But I guess when we talk about, that to me is one of the great markers of somebody who does have a great ear for voice, is like in your book, we have these three, I guess, key protagonists, right, who are all young men from, you know, really, really different backgrounds. And it shows they have these very distinctive ways of looking at the world. And they're all third person narratives, but you can still tell that they have their own idiosyncrasies and their own way of speaking and their own way of engaging with others. And that's not just how you've described them. A lot of that comes from the way the characters use their voices.
Sure.
How did you kind of go about achieving that, I guess?
I spent a lot of time on public transport because
Yeah.
I don't drive. So you can soak in a lot of the way people use colloquial language if you spend a lot of time on public transport. And I guess you just have to be a good listener. That's really important. In the same way that maybe it's more important to have good readers than good writers. I think it's better to be a good listener than, say, a good speaker. And so I spend a lot of time just listening closely. And there was a funny story, like my mum was really good friends with this famous Australian playwright, Dorothy Hewitt, playwright and poet. And she really had a great ear for colloquial Australian language and slang. And I went to her funeral when I was in, I think, first year university. And one of the stories that came out was that often on the train after school, when everyone was blabbering and talking shit and gossiping, she was just listening.
Yeah.
To how everyone spoke. And that's, I think, how you kind of get across that. And also, I just think there is so much poetry in colloquial language. You know, sometimes people make the mistake of thinking that you have to use this rarefied sort of arcane language to write good poetry. But I think there's so much poetry in slang. And so I've always loved that. And it was just going to be, it was always going to make its way into my fiction, I think. But you're right, it's a good way of sort of demarcating how each person, what their background is, their personality traits. You can access that through the dialogue.
And how do you think, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's right.
I was just going to ask how, like, what, as a writer for you, what comes first? Do you sort of hear Solomon's voice and take it from there? Does the character grow out of that? Or do you have to learn how they speak and how their, how their conversational tone and their inner monologue works?
Yeah, I mean, again, I got a really good piece of advice from Christos Scholkis about this, who said that he took a lot of cues from actors and from working in the theatre so that he could vocally embody his characters and even maybe walk, sometimes pacing around like a madman, walking the way the character would walk and talking the way they would talk. So, and also, of course, you take from people in your life. I mean, yeah. There's one character, Alex, the Macedonian guy, who was just so similar to a guy I grew up with, who just had this quite specific way of speaking. Someone like Jimmy, he's sort of gangly and lean, and I started I would speak his dialogue aloud. And I soon realized, he probably got a bit more of a nasal voice and it goes through his nose a little bit more. And then Solomon has a sort of a deeper voice. And so again, taking cues from actors and from the theatre and speaking these words aloud. Oh, and that's another really good piece of advice when it comes to the editing in cold blood. Read the work aloud, even if your readers won't be doing that. They'll be reading it in their heads when they're, on the couch or whatever. Read your work aloud, because any phrasing that is awkward and unnecessary words, they will make themselves abundantly clear when you read it aloud. And so that's a really important part of the editing process. I mean, it's a hard thing to do when you're dealing with something that's like 80,000 words long or whatever, but it really helps.
And you get, like, I think probably this comes more naturally to you because you're a musician and a rapper, and maybe as a poet as well. But I think, like, I read all of my work aloud before that's part of my editing process. And I don't have that musical background, but I think it really does give you a totally different sense of rhythm, as well as like any repetitions or grammatical mistakes or weird syntactical things. You get kind of this really nice musical sense of how your story sounds.
Definitely. And it is, it's word music. That's what it is. It's got rhythm, it's got cadence. And I mean, what I always liked about poetry was that you could sort of guide the reader's eye around the page just by using the tab button and a lot of spaces and everything like that. And that would sort of replicate in some way the flow of the voice reading it. And so I apply that to my fiction as well. I don't see why there's any rules why I shouldn't, lay out the paragraphs differently or guide the eye of the reader around the page.
No, I totally agree. And I think that's what makes, sometimes that is what makes like a novel or a novel-length manuscript all the more powerful. If the writing is amazing and the characters are memorable, there's absolutely no reason why a reader won't engage with verse or with things that are formatted in a weird or unusual way.
Yeah. Oh, well, I totally agree. Yeah, I can see there's a question here.
Yeah, I was going to say we've actually got a couple of questions. The first one is, how has place affected your work, and how do you write about it, or does it naturally come through story and character?
Oh, that's interesting question. Place has been really, really important in all of my work.
Yeah.
I grew up in Queanbeyan's a sort of interesting place. It's a liminal place. It's an in-between place. You know, even the shitty motto of the town is country living, city benefits, you know. So it's kind of like it's on the edge of Canberra, you know, which is very affluent, educated capital city of Australia. And then Queanbeyan was more working class. I mean, I think it's sort of changed now. I think it's a lot more middle class. But definitely when I was growing up, you know, people would make disparaging comments about Queanbeyan, struggle town, you know, it was where alcos lived, and there was a lot of violence and teen pregnancy and, you know, all this sort of thing. And that's definitely something I remember from growing up. But it's also a very multicultural place. It was had this particular blend of people, you know, a lot of people from the Balkans, and then islanders and Aboriginal people. Like, there's not many places in the world where where you'd have that particular blend. And so I got it in my head. What's that?
Sorry, I was just going to say, particularly not in a more regional area as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I sometimes felt like the place I grew up reflected how I was, because I was half white and half Asian. I grew up very religiously, but then, you know, Australia is very secular. And so I always felt I was a person who was in between worlds. And the very place I grew up was also like that. And so I don't know what it is, and maybe this is naive, but I always thought that that Queanbeyan was kind of a microcosm for Australia as a whole. And so that's my keyhole to looking at the world, is my hometown. And I'll probably die chasing the dream of perfectly trying to describe this place. That's all right.
Sorry, we've got another question. What are you reading right now? And the same person wants to know, do you find it easier to read something while you're working, or abstain totally?
Oh, I mean, no, I think you've got to be... Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm not reading the whole time. Like, there definitely are, you know, times in my life when there'll be a few months will go by and I haven't read a book. But then I have quite intense periods where I'll read, you know, a few a week or something like that. I think it's good to be reading while you're writing. I know some writers who say that there are writers they'll steer clear of because their voice is so persuasive that without even realizing it, you start to write like that person, especially if you adore them. And that's happened to me. Like, there was this one bit in Here Come the Dogs I remember rereading and going, man, I know what I was reading. I didn't realize I was like, I know exactly what I was reading at that time. That influenced me and the way I wrote that passage. No, as I said before, no good writing without good reading. So I think you should be trying to keep your brain fed.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I am like you. There are times when I read less, but as long as I'm writing, I've got to be feeding it. We've got a question from Brianna on Twitter. Really feel like Tony Jones right now on Q&A.
Sorry. What am I reading at the moment? I'm reading. Oh, this is a good one. Malay cooking for entertaining. And what else have I got here?
That's like the equivalent of the Women's Weekly, like, cake or like curried sausages of the 1970s.
I read a lot of non-fiction, especially history. My next book is going to be about Indonesia and Malaysia. So I've got all the books I'm reading at the moment are about that. This is Bugis navigation. So the Bugis were the great seafaring race of Indonesia, and had trade, you know, with the Aboriginal people, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And this is just a book about their navigational techniques and how to guide yourself through a reef, and dolphins and flying fish and lightning and floating debris and the stars. So, yeah, I don't know. You've got to read far and wide, and sometimes it won't even make its way into your writing.
So Brianna wants to know, I guess it leads into the question you just finished, but where do you begin with research? She says there can be so much on a topic. How do you sieve through it and integrate it into your stories?
Well, it's hard. I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling sometimes, the amount of reading you have to do. an example I can give was in Here Come the Dogs. I wanted to get a Sudanese guy's name right. Like, I wanted him to be from a particular part of South Sudan. I had to read so much around it about the history of Sudan and South Sudan and the war and everything. And it never even made it into the book. Like, and so it sort of drives you a little bit mad. So, I heard Rachel Kushner, this great American writer, speaking recently, and she was sort of saying how she tries to curate it quite closely. She doesn't like to read too much faff around it all. But every now and then you do just have to read large volumes of things, just even for one sentence or one name. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I guess it's just a feel thing. That's the only way you can navigate your way through it. But that's why it's so difficult.
Sometimes I reckon it's almost a question of doing too much and knowing when to pull back. And you can feel it too when you're reading a novel, particularly like a historical novel, and you just feel like the author wants to show you how much time they've spent doing research.
That's something to be really wary of, I think. Wearing your research on your sleeve too much. Because it can be distracting, and it might not be necessary. So a lot of this stuff is, about distilling information and reducing things right down to the essentials. And again, I think that comes more naturally because I come from a poetry background, and that's what poetry is. It's about distilling the words right down. But I find that to be, this will probably sound a bit bad, but I find the writing process itself just to be one of the most painful things in the whole world. It's torturous to me. Like it kills me. I'm like so full of self-doubt and drives me insane. But editing and sculpting and boiling it down, that to me is probably the only fun part of it.
I'm exactly the same. I thought you were going to say this sounds bad, but
I love writing. I don't actually. Like we all need our heads read. Everyone out there, what are you thinking? A sane person doesn't do this.
It's a tough job.
Yeah.
On that note, we've got a question from Jess who says, "How do you get over doubting your own voice? Do you ever feel like you're not smart enough to write about an issue that deeply affects you? What happens if that issue is controversial?"
All the time. I'm full of self-doubt and you lose faith constantly. And, I live for those moments when every now and then you just get that spark and you go, I nailed that. I absolutely nailed it. But it's pretty rare, but I do live for those moments. Most of the time it's, when you start going to all these writers' festivals, you always feel like the dumbest person in the room,
Oh, absolutely.
Hasn't read enough and, has such a limited vocabulary and hasn't experienced enough. But then you start to realize that everyone else is just as insecure.
Yeah, and like people make a lot of stuff up as well.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
It's all about faking it.
Like sometimes, you get this feeling like, man, has every writer actually read like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and stuff?
I've never read Tolstoy or James Joyce. That's like my shameful secret that I've just told the internet.
Yeah, well, there we go.
We've got time for one more question. This one is also from a different Jess. What are you working on right now? If you can give us any hints or sneak peeks. I know you mentioned. So, did you say it was a historical novel?
Kind of. I'm still figuring out what's going. It's about this blind Malay transgender sea captain who's leading a journey from Darwin into Indonesia, and each place that they land is a different moment in history or time. So it's kind of like gender bending, time traveling, and I'm sure it'll drive me to the precipice of madness doing it. But that's the next novel I'm working on. My book of poetry that I put out this year, I self-published it. It's just been picked up by Penguin, which is really cool. And we're going to do a bit of a brand new edition with probably like 5 more poems or 6 more poems in it. So I'm just working on a couple of those poems as well. And I've sort of had a book of stories bubbling away slowly. I find that my approach to writing fiction, like if I'm writing a novel, that has to be my sole focus. I have to have that as the main objective, and you work towards that. Whereas poems, I'm writing constantly, and stories, I'm writing quite haphazardly as well. And so those things come together in a more organic way, I guess, because you suddenly open up your computer one day after, 4 or 5 years, and you realize, oh, I've got enough poems for a book, maybe. I don't know. Whereas I haven't found it's that way with writing a novel. You have to sort of make the decision, like, I'm going to write a novel.
Yeah, it's a commitment.
Yeah, it's a real commitment.
Okay, sorry, we have one more lucky last. We've had heaps of questions, which is really nice. Oh no, we did that one. Sorry. No, we don't have any more questions.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thanks to Omar as well, of course, for giving his time and expertise. Everybody, rush out. His books are available anywhere that good books are sold, as they say. You can grab Here Come the Dogs online. As Omar just mentioned, his most recent poetry collection, Mil Fiore, will be re-released with a couple of newbies. And yeah, feel free to join us for our next Toolkit session. Our next guest artist is Tony Birch, and he'll be talking about setting. See ya.
He's awesome.
He is awesome. Take care.
Bye.